We're tackling the big guy himself, the patriarch, the father of three separate world religions, Abraham. You hear the name, you picture the wise old patriarch in a robe, staring up at the stars, the guy God supposedly chose to found a new nation. He is the central figure, embedded deep in the biblical narrative. But what if it's all a lie? I mean, the title of the video isn't just clickbait. What if the story of Abraham isn't etched in the stone of history, but is just an allegory, a myth? You find some truly bizarre clues in the text itself. Get this. In 1 Maccabees, there's a document claiming that the Spartans, those Spartans, and the Jews are related, and that both nations are descended from Abraham. Does that sound like history to you? Or does that sound like two groups making up a political story to build an alliance? So we have to dare to ask the question, did Abraham really exist? Because when you go looking for the actual guy, for the tangible evidence, well, it's as elusive as a desert mirage. There is nothing. And look, this isn't just me, your resident atheist, saying this. Even some modern theologians are finally catching up. There's a guy, Peter J. Leithart, a voice of faith, who basically said that evangelicals are too timid and that it's time to reckon with the myth of Abraham. He said that clinging to discredited biblical accounts of Abraham, as if these events actually happened, makes us look like Neanderthals. That's a believer telling you it's a myth. So, if Abraham is less man and more motif, what's the real story? What message is encrypted in his tale? Well, our journey today might just find its compass pointing somewhere you don't expect. It's pointing towards Greece. Let's get into it. So we've established that this whole Abraham thing feels more like political myth-making than actual history, right? Therefore, let's just take a second and actually listen to the official story that we've all just kind of nodded along to our whole lives. Let's recap the highlights, shall we? So, this guy Abram, who's 75 years old, gets a divine call to pack up his entire life and move to Canaan. And he's married to Sarai, who, checks notes, is also his half-sister. Okay, off to a normal start. Almost immediately, there's a famine, so they have to take refuge in Egypt. Now, Abraham, this great man of faith, is apparently so afraid that the Egyptians will kill him for his beautiful wife that he tells everyone, including the Pharaoh, that she's just his sister. Let's pause. Mind you, the text says Sarah is 10 years younger than him, which makes her 65 years old. But apparently, as the source text so beautifully puts it, she must have been smoking like a 20-year-old Playboy model because the Pharaoh sees her and takes her into his harem. Naturally, this all gets found out and they're expelled. So what's next in this totally historical document? Well, Sarai can't have kids, so she offers her maid, Hagar, to Abraham to bear a child. Hagar has Ishmael, and immediately tensions arise that lead to her exile. I mean, can anyone say Jerry Springer any faster? Then we get the divine visitor's warning about Sodom. The city is destroyed, Lot escapes, his wife turns into a pillar of salt, and his 2 daughters immediately get him drunk, drug him with wine, and sleep with him to carry on the family seed. You can't make this stuff up. But here's the best part. You'd think Abraham learned his lesson about the whole pamping out his wife thing, right? Wrong. They go to Gerar and he does it again. He tells King Abimelech that Sarai is his sister, and that king also takes her. Abimelech eventually gives her back, and wouldn't you know it, shortly thereafter, Isaac was born. I'm just going to read the question from the text here. Now, who's the real baby's daddy here? Abimelech or Abraham? This is the guy. This is the patriarch. This story is to set up for everything. The sacrifice of Isaac, Jacob and Esau, Joseph getting them into Egypt, the 430 years of slavery, and the entire Exodus with Moses. Does any of this sound like history to you? Or does it sound like a bizarre, cobbled-together soap opera designed to justify things much, much later? Okay, so the official story is bizarre. It's a soap opera full of family drama, sister wives, and kings stealing 65-year-old women. It screams myth. But for centuries, that didn't stop people. You've got to understand, the unquestioned existence of these figures was the default setting for almost 2,000 years. It was the modus operandi for even the sharpest scholars. So, with the rise of modern archaeology, you had historians and theologians, with what our source calls fervor akin to investigative detectives, heading out into the desert with their Bibles in one hand and the shovel in the other. This was the great quest for the historical Abraham. They were determined to tether these biblical tales to the realm of historical accuracy. Their main goal? To prove these stories fit in the 2nd millennium BCE. They tried everything. They heard the name Abraham and tried to link him to phonetically similar names from Egypt, claiming they must be Amorites. They looked at the Hyksos, those foreign invaders of Egypt, and said, aha, that's obviously Jacob and Esau. They used the genealogies and the names to try and connect all these historical dots, desperate to prove Genesis was just condensed history. And after all that digging, all that fervor, all those intricate genealogies, what did they find? You guessed it. Absolutely nothing. Zilch. Nada. No Abraham was here graffiti on a wall in Ur, no trade receipts, no mention of him, his son, or his grandson in any of the voluminous records from Egypt or Mesopotamia. The entire patriarchal age is an archaeological blank slate. The tangible evidence for Abraham, let alone all the bonkers stuff in Genesis, is exactly as elusive as a desert mirage. It just isn't there. So, we've got a bizarre story in one hand, and a total lack of physical evidence in the other. For a long time, scholars were just stuck. Therefore, in the latter half of the 20th century, a plot twist hits the academic world. A new generation of scholars comes along. Luminaries like Thomas L. Thompson and John Van Seters, and they don't just ask, where's Abraham? They flip the entire chessboard. They ask, why are we even looking for him? In 1974, Thompson publishes his magnum opus, The Historicity of the Patriarchal Narratives, and it is an absolute bombshell. He basically says what we've all been thinking. This quest for the historical Abraham is basically a fruitless occupation. Why? Because, as he argues, the intentions of the biblical authors are not comparable to those of the modern historian. Let me translate that from academic speak. They weren't trying to write history. The purpose of these stories, Thompson says, isn't historical. It's sociological, political, and religious. They're origin myths. They're stories written much later to create a shared past and a national identity. Now, you gotta understand how scandalous this was in 1974. This piece of writing got its author, Thompson, a decade-long involuntary vacation from employment. He basically got fired for saying the emperor had no clothes. But fast forward to today, this work, which cost him his job, has swayed scholarly consensus. This idea of enlightened skepticism is now the default position for most critical scholars. They've forsaken the attempt to finding Abe. If there ever was a guy, he's lost to us. But the character, the literary construct, oh, that's where it gets really interesting. Okay, so we've got a bizarre story, zero physical evidence, and a scholarly consensus that says, this isn't history. But this is where the apologists pivot. They say, okay, maybe it's not literal history, but it's an ancient myth. It's from that time, the 2nd millennium BCE. It's an authentic ancient story. Right? Wrong. This is where the whole timeline collapses. The text itself betrays its own origin story. It's absolutely full of anachronisms. What's an anachronism? It's an out-of-place item. It's the, as the source text brilliantly puts it, If you're discovering a gospel where Peter cruises in a Honda Civic, you would unmistakably hint at a narrative crafted in a more modern milieu. You'd know 100% it wasn't written in the first century. Well, similarly, Genesis contains anachronisms that point to its later historical genesis. Let's just take one great example from the archaeologist Israel Finkelstein. The Bible describes this massive 12th century BCE conquest of Canaan, right? But Finkelstein points out that archaeologically, many cited cities that were supposedly conquered didn't even exist yet. They only emergence in the 8th and 7th centuries BCE. Let me repeat that. How can one validate a 12th century BCE conquest of cities that archaeologically appear half a millennium later? You can't. It's a Honda Civic. Apologists will try to counter this. They'll say, but the names like Abram were common in the second millennium. As Thomas Thompson's scholarship shows, yeah, they were. But they also echoed into the 4th century BCE. So that argument is totally useless. They're just retrojecting, that's a fancy word for backdating, their new story into an antiquated setting to lend it a veneer of authenticity. They're trying to sell you a modern story in an ancient package. But they left the price tags on. So the timeline is totally broken. The story isn't from 2000 BCE and the Honda Civics prove it. Therefore, we have to ask the real question. If it's not ancient history, then when was it written? And by who? Now, for a long time, the safe answer was the exile, or Persian period, right after 586 BCE. The idea was that the Jews, exiled in Babylon, gathered all their old stories and wrote them down. It sounds plausible, right? But there's a huge problem with that theory. As scholars like Niels Peter Lemche and Philip R. Davies have pointed out, the Persian period in Palestine was, well, kind of a dump. We have very little information about the Jewish population then. The popular idea of a prosperous temple burgher society is basically a hypothesis with nothing to support it. The archaeological evidence shows the opposite. It wasn't a revitalization, it was more like a crumbling society that the Persians just didn't interfere in because they did not care. In fact, Israeli archaeologists for a long time demonstrated a contempt for the Persian period and removed its remains to rubbish dumps just to get to the real Israelite layers. A realistic assessment suggests that the Persian period was not the time when the Old Testament could have been written down. You don't get a massive literary masterpiece like Genesis out of a poor, crumbling, forgotten backwater. So if not then, when? When was the actual revitalization of the ancient Near East? When did city life vastly expand? When did a massive cultural and literary explosion actually happen? Only after the Greek takeover. We're talking about the Hellenistic period, after 300 BCE, after Alexander the Great conquered the entire known world and inferred the essence of the Greek world upon a vast expanse. This is the formative period of early Jewish thought and literature. This is the big reveal, folks. The authors of Genesis weren't ancient, robe-wearing shepherds from 2000 BCE. They were highly educated, fully Hellenized Jewish authors, probably living in places like Alexandria, hundreds and hundreds of years later. They were scholars who grew up learning all the Greek classics, Homer, Hesiod, Herodotus, and, as we'll see, most importantly, Plato. They decided their people needed a literary work that could compete with those he has read. They needed to invent a national epic of their own. So, we've landed on this idea. The authors were highly educated, Greek-speaking Jews living after Alexander the Great, probably around 300 to 270 BCE. They wanted to create a grand national epic for their people, something to compete with Homer and Herodotus. Therefore, how do you go about inventing a national history from scratch? You don't just make it all up. You follow a template, and the Greeks conveniently provided the perfect ones. First up, you've got the philosophical justification.
We mentioned Plato before, right? Well, Russell Gmirkin has pointed out Plato's concept of the noble lie. Basically, Plato argued that sometimes, for the good of the nation, you need to create a foundational myth, a story that gives people a shared origin and identity, even if it's not strictly true. Sound familiar? It's like a political instruction manual for writing Genesis. But it's not just the idea of inventing a past. It's the structure of the story itself. This is where the Greek foundation myth, or thesis, comes in. This was a super popular genre in the Hellenistic world. It was a standard way you told the story of how a city or a nation was founded. And as Russell Gmirkin lays out, the biblical story, especially the Exodus and Conquest, which is a whole payoff for Abraham's promise, follows the Greek casus playbook perfectly. Think about it like a checklist. Problem back home? Greek stories often start with why people left. Overpopulation, famine, war. The Bible? Israelites escaping slavery in Egypt. Check. Divine call and reluctant leader? Greek tales have a god, often via the oracle at Delphi, choosing a leader who's often hesitant. The Bible? God calls Moses at a burning bush on a holy mountain, and Moses famously protests, saying he stutters and isn't up to the task. Check. Guidance from the oracle or God? The Greek leader gets instructions, signs, and laws from the oracle. Moses? He's the lawgiver, receiving the Torah on Sinai. Check. The journey and wandering. Greek colonization often involved long journeys, setbacks, even generations of wandering. The Israelites? 40 years in the desert, long enough for the original generation to die off. Check. Establishing laws. The Greek oikist establishes the laws for the new colony, often claiming divine inspiration. Moses? He's the lawgiver, receiving the Torah on Sinai. Check. Conquering the Promised Land. Greek myths often involve displacing or conquering the native population, justified by divine promise. The Israelites? Joshua's conquest of Canaan, presented as a divine gift and obligation. I mean, come on. From the reluctant, stuttering leader chosen by God at a holy mountain, to the 40-year delay, to receiving divine laws, to conquering a promised land. It's the same narrative structure.
The authors didn't just borrow a few ideas, they took the whole Greek foundation story template and slapped the coat of Yahweh's paint on it. This isn't unique, revealed history. It's genre fiction 101. Hellenistic style. Okay, so we've just seen how the big picture story, the whole Exodus, wandering, and conquest saga, is basically a paint-by-numbers copy of the standard Greek foundation story, like this is. It hits all the same plot points. But what about Abraham himself? What about his most famous story? The one moment everyone knows, the ultimate test of faith. The binding of Isaac. Surely that's unique, right? That feels so deeply, fundamentally biblical. Wrong. This, my friends, is the real smoking gun. The part that, once you see it, you can't unsee. The authors didn't just borrow the template for the national epic, they stole the prologue too. Abraham's big test, the sacrifice of Isaac in Genesis 22, it's a direct, almost point-for-point rewrite of a very famous Greek myth, the story of Phrixus. Never heard of him? Let me give you the quick version. There's this Greek king, Athamas. He has a son, Phrixus. Evil stepmother, Ino, hates the kid and plots to have him killed by his own father. She bribes messengers to fake a message from the oracle at Delphi, saying the god Apollo demands Phrixus be sacrificed on a mountain to end the famine. So, King Athamas, being pious, takes his son up the mountain. Just as he's about to do the deed, bam! Zeus sends a magical golden-winged ram down to rescue the kid. Phrixus hops on, flies away to safety, and later, out of gratitude, sacrifices the ram after he's safe and hangs its golden fleece on an oak tree. Sound vaguely familiar? Let's break it down.
using the brilliant comparisons laid out by Neil Godfrey based on Philip Wachtzenbaum's work. Divine command to sacrifice son. Yep. Real in Genesis, a trick in the Greek myth, but the setup is the same. Check. Father's pious submission? Both Athamas and Abraham just obey. No questions asked. Check. Last-minute deliverance by a ram. Bingo! Divinely sent ram saves the day in both stories. Check. The ram gets stuck in or hung on a tree or thicket. Whoa, okay, now it's getting really specific. Check. Now notice the clever little flip the biblical authors did, what scholars call an inversion. In the Greek story, the ram rescues the boy, then it's sacrificed later in Thanksgiving, and its fleece is hung on the tree afterward. In the biblical story, the ram is found stuck in the bush before the sacrifice, and it's sacrificed instead of the boy. It's the same core elements, just slightly rearranged. As Godfrey notes, these narrative units, father, son, mountain, command, ram, tree, are like Lego bricks. You can swap them around, invert them, but it's clearly built from the same set. That particular detail about the ram in the tree or thicket is certainly distinctive enough to scream, borrowing. This isn't coincidence, folks. Given that we now know these texts were likely written in the Hellenistic era, when Jewish scholars were swimming in Greek culture, the possibility of direct borrowing cannot be rejected out of hand. But here's the absolute killer point. Why this story? Why copy the Phrixus myth? Because of its structural position.
Remember how Phrixus sacrifices the ram and hangs up its golden fleece? That fleece becomes the whole point of the next massive Greek epic, Jason and the Argonauts sailing to get it back. The Phrixus story isn't just random, it's the prologue to the Argonaut epic. And what is the binding of Isaac? It's the prologue to the entire rest of the Israelite epic. It's the ultimate test that seals the covenant, the promise of land and descendants that drives everything that follows. Moses, Exodus, the whole deal. Both near-sacrifice stories serve the exact same literary function. They kick off the larger epic. They are the origin point of the divine promises that guide the subsequent narratives. The Hellenistic Jewish authors needed a dramatic prologue for their national epic. They looked around, saw the famous prologue to the Argonauts, and thought, yeah, we'll take that. They just filed off the serial numbers, inverted a few details, swapped Zeus for Yahweh, and boom, instant ancient tradition. All right, buckle up because this is where all the pieces snap together. We've just seen how the most famous Abraham story, The Binding of Isaac, is a clear rewrite of the Greek myth of Phrixus, the kid saved from sacrifice by a golden ram. We saw the parallels, the father, the son, the mountain, the divine command, the ram, even the ram getting caught in a bush or hung on a tree. It's undeniable borrowing. Therefore, let's zoom out. We established that the Phrixus story serves a specific literary purpose in Greek myth. It's the prologue to the much larger epic of the Argonauts. Remember Jason and the Golden Fleece? That fleece is the fleece of the ram that saved Phrixus. The whole Argonaut epic is about retrieving that fleece to appease Zeus's anger over the attempted sacrifice of Phrixus, and ultimately, it's tied to the founding of the Greek colony of Cyrene in North Africa. So, if the prologues match, what about the epics they introduce? Guess what? They match too. It's the same structure. Greek version. The Phrixus sacrifice story leads to the Argonaut epic, a quest for a promised land involving divine promises, delays, and generations passing for fulfillment. Hebrew version. The Isaac sacrifice story leads to the Israelite epic, a quest for a promised land involving divine promises, delays, and generations passing for fulfillment. It's the same narrative arc. Both stories use the near sacrifice as the origin point for the divine promises that drive the entire rest of the epic journey toward a destined land. But wait, it gets even better. This is the part that should make your jaw drop. Remember how the Argonaut epic is about fulfilling that promise of land made generations earlier? Well, generations later, a direct descendant of one of the Argonauts is commanded by the oracle at Delphi to finally lead his people to settle Cyrene. His name is Battus. And guess what Battus means in Greek? It means stutterer. And what does Battus do when the oracle tells him he's the chosen one? He protests, he argues he's not a great warrior, and crucially, that he has a speech impediment. But the oracle forces him to go anyway. And Herodotus tells us Battus ruled Cyrene for, wait for it, 40 years.
Who does that sound like? It's Moses, the guy God calls to lead the Israelites to their promised land. What does Moses do? He protests, telling God he stutters. But God forces him to go anyway. And how long does Moses lead the people through their final journey and wandering? 40 years. This isn't just similar, it's practically the same character arc. The narrative structure joining Abraham to Moses echoes with accuracy the promise made to Euphemus and its fulfillment by descendant Battus. Both reluctant leaders, both defined by a speech impediment, both fulfilling a generations-old promise after a 40-year period. It's like the biblical authors took the Argonaut epic, highlighted the key plot points, and said, okay, we need a stuttering leader named Musha. And notice, as Wagenbaum points out, how the biblical author cleverly plays with the Greek source material. Abraham plays two different characters from the Greek epic. He's like King Athamas, the father who almost sacrifices his son, and he's like the Argonaut Euphemus, who receives the promise of land for his descendants. The biblical author just reversed the order of the episodes, promise first, then sacrifice, just like they inverted the detail of the ram in the bush. This isn't random coincidence. As Neil Godfrey puts it, the similarity between Isaac and Phrixus alone might make you wonder. But when placed in the wider framework of the Argonaut epic and the foundation of the colony of Cyrene, it allows us to question a likely influence of the Greek mythical tradition on the writings of the Old Testament. It's not just one stolen scene, it's the whole damn movie plot. We're looking at a Jewish Argonauts. So let's just recap where we've been on this wild ride. We started with the universally accepted image of Abraham, the patriarch, but we immediately saw red flags, like that bizarre claim linking Spartans to Abraham, and even modern theologians admitting he's likely myth. Therefore, we looked at the official story itself and found a bizarre soap opera that reads nothing like history. But people tried to prove it was history for centuries, digging for evidence. Therefore, we saw they found absolutely nothing, a complete archaeological blank slate. Therefore, modern critical scholarship, starting with pioneers like Thomas, declared the quest fruitless, because the stories aren't history, they're political and religious origin myths. But couldn't they be ancient myths? Therefore, we hit the Honda Civic problem. The text is riddled with anachronisms that prove it was written much later than the supposed 2nd millennium BCE setting. Therefore, we pinpointed the real authors and the real time. Highly educated, Greek-influenced Jewish scholars in the Hellenistic period, after 300 BCE, writing to create a national epic. Therefore, we looked for their templates. We found smoking gun number 1. The entire Exodus conquest narrative structure is a carbon copy of the standard Greek foundation myth, the ktisis, right down to the stuttering leader Moses mirroring the Greek figure Battus. But what about Abraham's defining story? Therefore, we found smoking gun number 2. The Binding of Isaac is a direct rewrite of the Greek myth of Phrixus, the prologue to the Argonaut epic, with the last-minute rescue by a ram caught in a bush. Therefore, and here's the grand finale, we saw the entire structure, from the near-sacrifice prologue through the epic quest for a promised land led by a stuttering hero, is the same framework as the famous Greek Argonaut cycle. So, what's the inevitable takeaway from all this evidence? Abraham isn't a historical person. He's a character. He's the Jewish Heracles, the Israelite Aeneas, a brilliant literary invention crafted by savvy, Hellenized Jewish authors sometime around the 3rd century BCE. They wanted to write their people into cultural relevance in a world dominated by Greek literature, using the most popular tools of their day, Greek epic structures, Greek myths, and Greek philosophical ideas like Plato's noble lie. Therefore, the story of Abraham is a lie. But maybe lie is too harsh. It's a masterful piece of literary propaganda, a noble lie designed to forge a national identity and give a scattered people a grand, epic origin story that could stand shoulder to shoulder with Homer. It's an incredible achievement of creative writing, weaving together disparate threads into a compelling narrative tapestry. The real problem isn't the story itself. The problem is that for over 2,000 years, we've been told, forced really, to read this brilliant mythological epic as if it were a dry, boring, and frankly, completely unsupported history textbook. That, my friends, is the real myth we need to debunk. Whew, okay, that was a lot, I know. We've journeyed from Ur to Egypt, through Sodom, and ended up firmly in ancient Greece. It becomes increasingly evident that understanding Abraham's tale requires this detour through Hellenistic noir. If today's exploration blew your mind even a little bit, do me a favor, like this video, subscribe to the Rational Farid if you haven't already, and definitely join the conversation in the comments below. Tell me what your favorite part was, or what questions you still have. Seriously, we're just scratching the surface here. There's so much more to uncover in our upcoming series on the origins of the Bible. If you want exclusive content, early access to videos, and want to support this rational quest, consider joining our YouTube membership community. You become part of the family, helping us navigate this rich tapestry of ancient narratives. Until next time, keep delving, keep questioning, and stay curious.